Perfect. Great.
Good.
So already, Jane, you're on top of it. So welcome, Ariane. It's fantastic to have you here as another MSP, and that is great that you're here. And if anybody else joins in, I will give them a shout out as well. So all participants were emailed the agenda and the list of attendees earlier today. So there's been about 50 people signed up again, which is great if everybody attends. And we've also just had a wee quick discussion about maybe if people could put in the chat function where they are right now in Scotland or England or somewhere else. You know, last time it was Ireland. It would be really handy to just put where you are so that we can build a wee map of for maybe a future meeting of where people are attending, where they're sitting right now. That would be maybe helpful if you choose to do that. Other things on my list, the Rural Policy Centre is our secretariat. They have a note, Jane has a note of all the apologies received, and that will be listed in the minutes as usual. And the Rural Policy Centre will be tweeting during the meeting. So if anyone else is tweeting or retweeting, please use the hashtag CPG Rural. And that means we'll all continue to link together and follow the conversation on the dreaded Twitter. So hopefully there'll be some positives out there. Usual info, I've already mentioned that please keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question. And if you ask a question, you can do it with two options, either put your hand up or put the question in Teams in the chat function. That way I can either read the question out again, and obviously you can put a question in the chat function or put your hand up. The minutes for this meeting will be prepared as soon as possible following tonight's session, and then it'll be uploaded to the cross-party group area on the Rural Policy Centre website. And then I suppose we need to approve the minutes from the last meeting first, Jane, don't we? And then I'll go on to talk about any other issues that we need to take forward. So our first action point tonight is anybody that was at the last meeting have read the minutes, and can we propose to approve them? And then a seconder.
Saw a thumbs up there from Jim Hume.
Okay, great. Okay, so Jim Hume, thank you very much. Former MSP Jim Hume is here tonight, so thanks, Jim, for proposing. Is there anyone that was here at last meeting that can maybe give a seconder to the minutes? I'm looking for nods or hands or anybody else. Abigail Williams, I see Abigail has wrote in the chat function that she will second them. So thank you very much.
Great.
Okay, righty. So if there's anything that needs to be corrected in the minutes from tonight when they get posted on the Rural Policy Centre website, please email the Rural Policy Centre if you note that anything needs to be corrected in the minutes, okay? And Secretariat will ensure that any action points or links, etc., are noted and included in the meeting minutes, okay? So we're very organised. So, okay, I've approved the minutes, and it looks like Jane, our secretariat, has uploaded the recordings of the presentations on the web along with the minutes. So please, folks, take a look at the cross-party group website info, because the presentations are loaded up there as well, and it's always really handy to go and look back. So and the Secretariat for this Rural Policy Cross-Party Group has also written to the Secretariat of the Women in Enterprise Cross-Party Group to inform them of the topic of our last meeting in March, and to alert them to the meeting minutes and the recording, so that that's available. I think there's many of our cross-party groups cross policy areas, and for the Rural Enterprise or the Women in Enterprise cross-party group, there's a lot of crossover, so that's great that that has been done. Okay, alrighty. So On to our presentations, everybody. So there's we've got 6 short presentations tonight, and the theme is doing more with less. Each speaker has a maximum of 8 minutes. So we'll put the clock on, and or I'll maybe have to butt in if somebody goes longer. I know 8 minutes it flies by, but there will be a chance for questions. So up to 8 minutes, but ideally 6. And we've got the 6 speakers covering a range of topics and regions, from a local alternative to Airbnb for Scotland's islands, warm hubs in Northumberland, rural community development in Northern Ireland, and a sustainable farming initiative in Arran. And speakers have been asked to roughly structure their presentations as follows. What do you have less of, like money or people, etc.? What impact has the less had on your activities or on the activities of those people who your work or organisation is supporting? And what kinds of responses have been tried to deliver more and or deliver better? And then what successes have been achieved? And what would be your key message for the Scottish Government in relation to doing more with less? Okay, so lots of questions, so it is going to be a challenge to, you know, hit the topics in 6 minutes, but that's the challenge. And I will introduce all of our speakers briefly now, but then each speaker is going to hand over to the next speaker rather than bring me back in, because there are 6 speakers and it'll just help make the flow go faster instead of going back and forward. So once each speaker has finished, they will introduce the next speaker, and everybody has been prepared for that. So our 6 speakers are Rhoda Meek, who is involved in a number of projects on the Isle of Tiree, but today she will tell us about her isleholiday.com initiative, which provides a local alternative to Airbnb. Then we'll hear from Andy Dean, who's Chief Executive of Community Action Northumberland, and Andy will talk to us about Northumberland Warm Hubs, which aim to provide local communities with a safe, warm and friendly environment to enjoy refreshments and the company of other people. That sounds great. And then after that, there will be Dr. Ruth Macarivi, I hope I got that right, who is a reader in sociology at Newcastle University. And Dr. Ruth will summarise the findings of her recent work in Northern Ireland, focusing on the future of funding for rural community development. Then number 4 is Professor Andrew Barnes, who is Professor of Rural Resource Economics at SRUC. And Professor Andrew will then focus on sustainable intensification and efficiency from an agricultural perspective. And then lastly, Alexander Perry from SAC Consulting will introduce the Net Zero Arran project, which is led by a group of farmers who are identifying steps that can take to work towards lower carbon footprints and ideally a net zero Arran. And then finally, Professor Davy McCracken, who I know really well, is a Professor in Agricultural Ecology at SRUC. Davy will close the presentations part of the evening by providing some reflections on overarching themes that have been raised by all of the speakers. So just to recap, running order, Rhoda first, then Andy, then Ruth, then Andrew, Alexander and then Davy. Okay, so just before I hand over to Rhoda, I'm going to mention that Rhoda is up first tonight, as right after this presentation she needs to head to an awards ceremony as she's been nominated in the top 100 women in tourism. Special thanks to Rhoda for agreeing to speak to us tonight before she heads to that event, and I'm sure we all will wish you the very best tonight and good luck. And I see lots of hand claps, so that's fantastic. So okay, and first up, Rhoda, it's up to you. I will mute my microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was hoping I'd get away with that, but Jane let the cat out of the bag. Thank you very much for that very warm welcome, Emma. I do really appreciate it. And apologies, I will miss the other speakers. So yes, I'm Rhoda Meek, and I am permanently resident in the Isle of Tiree. I'm going to just take that back a second. I'm a trainee crofter, I call myself, and I work for tech startups to pay the bills. I run my own small business selling tea and yarn, and I also run Isle Develop, which is a social enterprise that started during COVID with the Isle 20 island shopping site. And now we're moving into talking about housing by launching a holiday lettings platform that's been mentioned. And I'll tell you that a little bit more about that in a moment. But I wanted to start with what we have less of. We, as Isle Develop, have just finished an informal mapping exercise. So we can go back to the slide now, sorry, because I want to start by showing you some images of Tiree. The green icons are permanently resident people. The red icons are houses that are owned by people who do not live here. 59% of those houses are not even holiday lets. They're owned by people who come back once or twice a year and the house sits empty. And that equates to 27% of our entire housing stock. In the winter, that means that 46% of our lights are out. Only 54% of houses have permanent committed residents, and we have an increasingly elderly population. And actually watching these lights go out has been quite a sobering exercise. Yeah, thank you for that. We can take that down. I won't make you watch it the whole time. Over 80% of respondents to a recent Tidy Trust survey said that housing provision does not meet the needs of our community. So aside from housing and permanent residents, what else do we have less of? The problem is that we have less of everything because of the housing issue. We do not have enough teachers, enough carers, enough voluntary firefighters. My village has no children. We don't have enough staff for hospitality, for the garage. We don't have enough coast guards or first responders. So the impact of this is serious at every level of our community life. And the outlook is actually quite catastrophic. We do a lot with less, and we rely on individuals and community organisations to do a lot. But the combined effect of this housing crisis, coupled with transport and connectivity issues, are having a big impact on confidence and on people's desire to keep trying to live in these places. People are frustrated. They resent having to campaign for affordable housing to resolve a problem that's not of their making, whilst they drive past houses in darkness all winter. People are tired. The effort to get building projects off the ground in an island like Tiree is immense. Couples on median wages with kids are outbid by cash buyers, sometimes who've barely Googled the place. Never mind visited. Key workers currently can't get accommodation for ad hoc visits. They're being housed in holiday house accommodation, and not cheaply. Our nursing home and our school are crying out for staff, but in both cases, recent recruits have turned down offers because there's no housing. We're losing Gaelic language and culture at a terrifying rate. We talk about the importance of saving that, but with houses, we can't. We talk about the importance of island resilience, multi-pillar economies, but there are no houses available for the people who do the work. It's complicated, but the situation is not going to get better by itself. We need to get honest and we need to get creative. So Isle Holiday is an effort to do that. It's a holiday letting site for the Scottish Islands. Just like Airbnb, we list properties, we take bookings on behalf of owners, and we take a commission. But we won't offshore the profits as we get up and running. Instead, all surplus is going to go back into supporting small businesses and housing projects in the islands. We don't know exactly how we're going to do it yet, but we are talking to a whole variety of groups to figure out what we can do to help. And we're doing it because we're realists. We understand that we can't force people to sell. And if we did, prices remain ridiculous. The current market means long-term letting is not always a viable option for people. And we understand that second homes and letting properties exist for a lot of reasons. And we don't want to lose our tourism, but it does need to work better. So it's not a perfect solution, but it's a start. And I hope that it has started a conversation or continued a conversation and keeps highlighting the issue. We've had a huge amount of support from people locally in the islands who are resident in the islands. And we're hoping that that will continue to grow and maybe start moving into those who have properties in the islands but might not be resident. So if I had a message for the Scottish Government right now, it's this. If you fancy encouraging island authorities to demand that people list their properties on Isle holiday as part of their licence commissions, we wouldn't say no. Seriously though, and it is actually serious. Please speak to us. Actually listen to those of us who live in the islands. Please don't approach us with top-down ideas. I'm going to mention the Islands Bond because I don't think anyone in the islands had been talked to about it before it was released to the press. Throwing people at the islands is not the answer to this, but by all means throw houses at us. And then let communities work out what they need and what they don't need in terms of skills. Please show us that you respect us enough to actually do an islands impact assessment on your policies, all of them. Impact assessments that talk to islanders and get down to brass tacks, like can any one resident get off the island in the summer? Please treat our islands like the really fragile ecosystems they are. Understand that what Visit Scotland pumps out is very pretty and beautiful, and we do live in beautiful places, but it's not the reality. And this is without touching on geese and ferries and agricultural policy and broadband, which I've been told to rein myself in. But the R100 will not reach 100%. And again, the islands are going to be left behind. So everything we do with less. Despite that, our small businesses are incredible. Our musicians are world class. Our communities are run by volunteers who juggle roles and lives and kids and crofts with skill and with passion. So imagine what we could do with a bit more and a few more houses. Thanks for listening to my just under, I hope, 8-minute rant. I really do appreciate it. And I would love to stay for the rest. I look forward to catching up on the recording. And I'm delighted to be handing over now to Andy Dean for the next presentation.
Thank you, Rhoda, and good luck this evening from everybody here. Yes, thank you. So Andy Dean, Chief Executive at CAN, Community Action Northumberland. We're part of something called the ACRE Network, Action with Communities in Rural England. So there's a equivalent of CAN in each of the English counties. So it's just so you can place us. Yeah, so we were asked to think about what we've got less of. It kind of, the list goes on and on, doesn't it? But sort of fundamental, and at the risk of pointing out the very, very obvious, less people, more space between them, and kind of what that results in is less services, because services are much more expensive to deliver for all sectors actually. So for public sector, private sector, voluntary sector as well. So less services, and also for us as a sort of charity trying to support rural communities in Northumberland, much greater difficulty in trying to access funding to try and make things happen, because the scale isn't big enough, it's not visible enough for strategic programs, etc., etc. So yeah, less people, less money, and actually a lot of organizations find it much more difficult to get information out. So when there are strategic organizations trying to do things in the rural parts of Northumberland, they don't know where to go, where to start, how to get it there, and it's often end up seemingly not bothering because of that. So although I'm sure that's not the case. So yeah, less of all those things. How do we make more out of that? The specific movements, I'm not going to call it a project because projects start and finish. The specific movements I'm going to talk about in Northumberland is warm hubs. And I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I will put a couple of links in the chat when I'm done. So in fact, the chair sort of summarised what a warm hub is in her introduction, but I'll just repeat it word for word. Warm hubs are places within the local community where people can be assured of finding a safe, warm and friendly environment in which to enjoy refreshments, social activity, information and advice, and the company of other people. What a lot of people say when they hear that is, oh, right, you mean coffee mornings? No, we don't mean coffee mornings. So the approach to warm hubs is very much a holistic thing. They're all based in village halls or other community buildings. And what they're about are, the first thing is we make sure that the building is fit for purpose. So that includes making sure that we support in the management committees to undertake their risk assessments, carry out energy audits of the whole building, and also accessibility checks, and then also trying to help implement the findings of those things. So we provide a small grant as part of the scheme. By small, I mean £500. So doing more with less is definitely the right phrase, to help, particularly on the energy stuff. So it might be double glazing, it might be new kitchen equipment that's more efficient, whatever it is. But making sure that the place itself, as the name implies, is warm, both physically and in terms of its welcome. We're also making sure that the organisations are fit for purpose. So that's all the traditional stuff, you know, around making sure the governance is right, the policy, all the right policies are in place, insurances, licenses if they need them for whatever they're doing. So the building, the organisation, but then they're relatively straightforward things to get right, I think. The bit that's absolutely fundamental is the volunteers. So we support the organisation, the committees at these places to make sure that their recruitment process is effective and is suitable for their patch, and then also provide ongoing support and training as demanded, as seen fit by those volunteers and by the organisers around things like might be dementia awareness, food safety, obviously, quality and diversity, first aid, and all sorts of other things. So, and what we then knew, so we've got the venue, we've got it being run by volunteers, which is absolutely fundamental because it's the only way to make sure these things are going to carry on into the future without, you know, it being a project. But then these also then provide places where we can go and deliver things, so bits of information, so things like carbon monoxide awareness, helping people get on the priority services registers of utility companies, odd projects, odd as in unique rather than weird, projects around things like slow cooker demonstrations, because slow cookers are so much more energy efficient than conventional ovens. We go along and give a demonstration, and then at the end of it, anybody who hasn't got a slow cooker can take one away because we can get them quite cheaply from various places. So lots of things. So the venue is there, the people are there running it, and we can offer various things through that, not in a hard sell sort of way, but just turning up now and again to deliver things. And also what we found is other services, health services, wherever they might be, age concern, have also jumped on the bandwagon to do exactly the same thing. So the warm hub is there. They run sometimes weekly, sometimes fortnightly, sometimes just monthly sessions, events where people come along and they have something to eat, they have a chat, they do whatever they're going to be doing, but then there's a little bit of information flow as well. What it also does is mean that we as an organisation can then, because that network is so effective, can use that to then try and draw in other resources. So as an example, we were able to bid successfully, finally, to the Energy Saving Trust, the Energy Redress Scheme, last May, all very much on the back of the fact that we had this reach right out into the very remote parts of Northumberland for funding to employ 2 energy advisors who provide, which is, you know, amazingly good timing as things have turned out. But we've got people who could go out and give advice to anybody, but actually use the warm hubs as a place to do that on a very informal basis. So those sort of things kind of piggyback on the back of it, and just reinforces the warm nature of these places. I think the thing I'd like to emphasise though is that these aren't about, yes, they're in buildings that are well looked after, well managed, etc. But actually, it's all about the volunteers. They're not our warm hubs. They're the place's warm hub. They're run by volunteers. We're just supporting that to happen. So it's very much a light touch. And we did a little assessment, and the sort of cost to us, if we were going to say, somebody came to us saying, how much does it cost to set up a warm hub? It's just under £2,000, which is the £500 grant, energy audits, bits of training, and a little bit of money for us to actually support us in doing the next one down the line. So very, very cost effective. The last thing we were asked to do was to think about key messages to leave you with, and I think it kind of echoes a little bit what was the previous speaker was saying. For me, what warm hubs demonstrate is that grassroots is where success comes from. Certainly long-term success, ongoing success. They can kind of transcend the comings and goings of, you know, funding programs and strategic policies and whatever else. Actually, if you get things right at that level and enable local people to be doing things very successfully, then that's actually worth its weight in gold in terms of going forward. And what we've also found is that because we've started a network of these warm hubs, other places have wanted to join in. So the network has grown and grown over the years. And the final thing in terms of key message would be, and it's the age-old saying of small is beautiful. These are all very small scale things which are doing their thing and working really, really effectively. However, while small is beautiful, the ability to actually join them all together to say this is a network actually makes it much more visible, to make it slightly easier, hopefully, for strategic programs and policies to actually find a way into doing something positive in rural communities. So there we go. Hopefully that's definitely less than 8 minutes. I will conclude there and hand over to, or pass the baton up the road, because also in Newcastle is Ruth McAreevy. Over to you, Ruth.
Thanks very much, Andy. So I think there's going to be a bit of a theme here, continuing from what Rhoda was saying and from Andy's presentation, particularly around the grassroots issue. And Jane asked us to speak around these questions of doing more with less. So fundamentally, my presentation is based on a piece of work I did for kind of the equivalent of Andy's organisation in Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Rural Community Network and the Northern Ireland Rural Women's Network. And they were concerned about the removal of leader funds, which, as you'll know, were funded through Europe, and the absence of very much discussion about what would follow in the wake of that. So I did a piece of work for them last year and into the early months of this year, talking to people who were involved in local action groups and interviewing them and a number of focus groups. So I'm going to just sort of draw from the findings of that. And Alexa, would you mind moving on to the next slide, please? Great. So I'll put a link in after my presentation, because you can, for those who want to read the fuller report, there's a fuller report on the Rural Community Network's website. I mean, doing more with less, the key issue here is the removal of funds and the very real likelihood that the amount of funds coming into rural Northern Ireland are going to be much less than they were. And apologies for those who understand this extremely well, but I think going back to the core premise of the leader approach is really insightful, because you'll recall that it's all about partnership working, innovation, networking, bottom-up development, that sort of grassroots engagement that Andy was just talking about, cooperation, and it's about emphasis on both product and process. And these are fundamentals that have appeared right throughout different iterations of the LEADER programme. And I think part of the challenge that my research identified in Northern Ireland is that some of those key principles have been eroded over the more recent programmes. And I think if we could sort of, my recommendations very much to the Rural Community Network, where if government can start to reintroduce some of these issues back into whatever a new rural development programme would be, then they will very much be able to do more with less. So I'm just going to talk through some of the positives that I found within the research, and then the less positive things before making some recommendations. Time and again, people talked about the grassroots engagement and the capacity of local people to have a voice in a process. They really, really valued that. And that dovetailing with different agencies, be they local government or other third sector organisations, that was completely valued in the LEADER approach. And also the type of support that communities were able to draw down, be it through financial, which is the obvious one, but also technical and the development support. That is really important. And that's an especially large issue, I think, in the context of the levelling up agenda, where pre-development support seems to have pretty much disappeared, and there's very little sign of that coming through. Collaboration within and between local communities was valued, and this goes to the heart of the ideas of innovating and working in partnership, both through project delivery but also learning from other places. That was really, really inspiring for communities and helping them to think through some difficult, complex issues outside of their own locality. They found it really beneficial. and also job creation. There were jobs created, and the research revealed very much that that was valued. So there were some aspects of the programme that were much less positive. There was a real kind of concern about the lack of gender representation, and fewer than 35% on average were female LAG members, and nearly 80% of the successful applications were led by men. So and this was an issue that has been cited and identified over a number of years, and the pre-programme evaluation really identified that gender would be an issue, but it seems that appropriate monitoring and evaluation didn't happen throughout the programme. So that was another weak spot. And disproportionate audit and bureaucracy. I mean, I spoke to some people who talked about having to do audit for the European Commission, audit for the local government, and audit for the Northern Ireland office. And I mean, that just seems excessive, particularly for projects that are pretty small overall in financial terms. So that disproportionate audit reared its head time and again throughout the research. And the recent programme seemed very much more to be a funding-led programme. It was all about getting money spent into the communities, and success therefore was evaluated much more about, did we get the money out? Did we get it spent? Great, but successful programme, rather than thinking through some of the social impact and some of the maybe alternative ways to think about value and wider community impact on the ground. And there was a definite sense of unequal playing fields and unequal capacity to participate in the programme. Alexa, could I have the next slide, please? And this is my last slide as well. And for reasons that I won't go into in this short bit of time, the councils were employing the LAG managers, and there was definite feeling that councils were, as this quote says, sort of slipping projects in that they would have been wanting, and that's what was worrying many people going forward, that relationship and role of the council in leading on community-led local development. And then the other issue is about capacity and competency to participate in the programme. So it's not just good enough to have the representation, but questions need to be asked about the ability and the expertise of individuals who are sitting around the table. Do they have voice in decisions that are being made? Can they fully participate and contribute to the development of projects and to the discussions that are happening? And I would say that very much that wasn't the case. There were definitely some individuals who felt intimidated by the kind of committee processes and the technical aspects of the programme. So just to finish up then, in terms of messages for Scottish Government, thinking through local-led development programmes, and this echoes what Rhoda and Andy were saying, the importance of that sort of bottom-up development and that grassroots engagement, rather than landing things onto communities, but starting with where communities are at. And that includes engagement at the design phase of any programme and a clear alignment of expectations, because the Northern Ireland case very much demonstrated that expectations were sitting in different places, and that caused tension throughout. And I think there's a real need also for targeted interventions to bring in new actors. And I know that there's some really good practice, particularly I spoke to some people in Scotland about this, creating opportunities to bring people in who have never been engaged before. So my recommendation is the idea of creating multiple entry points into a programme and embedding pre-development support into the process. And management audit monitoring needs to be adequate for the size of the fund. And I also think finally that there has to be space for the trial of innovative processes. And again, I know that there's been good practice in Scotland around participatory budgeting, for instance, but there can be other processes that are able to be trialled that I think can have a really positive impact and allow communities and government to do more with less. And it's all about levering in those different resources and working in partnership. So that is the end of what I want to say. I'll be very happy to answer questions. I'm very pleased to pass over to Professor Andrew Barnes. Andrew.
Thank you, Ruth. I've got a more, I think, quite a broad topic, which is around agricultural efficiency, and I was really going to present a series of studies and work that we've been involved with looking at this issue of efficiency. And I suppose that's really the question that we have now. What do we have less of? Well, access to inputs is quite an acute issue given the disruptions in supply chains that we're having as well. So if you could put the next slide on, please, Alexa. So I'm giving you a slide there which comes from Scotland. So it's really a way to measure how we're doing effectively in terms of how we're using our inputs and our outputs as a way to show how we're using our efficiency. So you can see that generally it's an upward trend, which means that we're becoming more productive. We're using our inputs in a more efficient manner. So the next slide, please, Alexa. And what we did was we looked at that and said, well, how does Scotland compare with the rest of the world? You know, are we doing better? Are we doing worse? So we compared with some US economists how Scotland was doing relative to other key agricultural economies as well in terms of growth rates and also over time. And you can see that Scotland in the last period has grown quite considerably. So it holds its own weight for such a small country against other states as well in terms of how it's managing its resources and its inputs as well. So next slide, please. However, what these show you really is the amount of variance within the different farm types. So what we're finding is at the average, we're doing okay, but we seem to have a very big distribution, even when we're looking at those particular farms themselves. So we have some farms that are performing at the top of their game, who are demonstrating best practice in the way they use efficient use of resources, but also farms within the same type and some within the same region who aren't using them so effectively. So those slides show you all the variances that we see within those farms. So we have to ask the question, why is it that some farms are performing much better than others? So if you click on the next one, Alexa. We looked at some of the issues in terms of just the access to good land, levels of education, succession planning, age and attitude. Those sort of aspects seem to come out as fairly constant drivers towards the differences between the efficient use of resources compared to those who were sort of lagging behind effectively. So the next slide, please. So what we did was we looked at ways in which we could try to improve or push productivity through within the industry. And these were really the three ways. You could adopt new technologies. So there's a lot of technology out there, but clearly you need the finance base to help you to invest in those technologies and the skills to adopt those technologies. Changing the size of the business was another aspect in terms of what you could do in terms of increasing the size of the business or even reducing the size of the business to become more efficient. And also changing your input-output mix, which is quite important as we move towards policy agendas that are perhaps more ecological in focus and trying to produce more benefits for society in terms of reducing some of the environmental impacts as well. So next slide, please. And this was another slide from the FAO that we looked at, which really looked at some of the relationships between innovation and structural change within an industry and how policy can help to realize some of those changes as well in terms of the way it could intervene in terms of policy or support technology or support management interventions as well. So next slide, please. I think what's important as well is to know that we did work looking at the supply chain, and we looked at the power dynamics in terms of where the farmer is. So may have found that there's such a wide variance in terms of performance, but farmers are only actors within quite a big chain, and decisions that maybe people want to adopt more technologies or different practices are affected by the power supply. So we have a massive set of players here and actors here who are dictating what farmers can and can't do effectively. So we looked at what we call an innovation supply chain. So this was for barley, and we did similar ones for other sectors as well. And they're similarly as complex as well. So that became a problem effectively in terms of trying to get farmers to adopt more technologies as well to become more efficient. So the next slide, please, Alexa. And the final point, I suppose the point I want to make is that as we've looked at technology at farm in terms of the practices, what we have done is we have a list, an ever-growing list of practices that seem to be cost effective. We have about 300 measures now that are growing, which you would call win-win measures. So those are measures that improve productivity, but also help to support environmental goals as well. Now they don't fit every farm. There are barriers towards that as well. But effectively, it seems to be a message that there are lots and lots of measures and practices out there that farmers could adopt. Now we need to think about the way that we demonstrate these measures, the way we frame these measures in terms of engaging with farmers, and the way we can incentivize adoption for those measures as well. So currently we're at a crucial point where we're reforming the agricultural policy and support mechanisms as well. So aiming for more sort of technology adoption, helping to manage risk, for example, and trying new methods and practices through things like engaging in networks of best practice as well, may help to improve those efficiencies. So those farmers that seem to lag behind just in that sort of efficiency metric that we showed you, it may help them in terms of adoption of some of those measures as well. Okay. Thank you, Alexa. So with that, I'll hand on to Alexander Peary.
Thanks very much, Andrew. First of all, really good to be joined by everybody tonight, and really looking forward to talking a bit about the climate change group that we've kicked off. I never miss an opportunity to talk about Arran. So we started the Net Zero Arran group over on the Isle of Arran in 2019. Next slide, Alexa, please. So we kicked off the Net Zero Arran group. First of all, Net Zero is an aspirational title. It's not necessarily something that we'll be able to achieve, but it is something that we want to work towards and be constructive. We launched in 2019. At the time, we had 12 businesses that were interested in building upon the messages that were established off the back of the Scottish Government's beef efficiency scheme, which had just kind of come towards the end of its lifespan. And the big takeaway from our clients on Arran was that they wanted to better understand the carbon auditing process. They wanted to understand how it could be implemented at farm level and what the changes were likely to be. They wanted to be more involved, and they wanted to see an impact at the local level, which was really important for us. So we developed this strategy, which is now built up to 35 businesses on the island. And we have been carbon auditing with them now for the last 3 years. Next slide, please. One of the questions that we were asked to consider was what do we have less of? And I would argue that we have less time to adapt and to mitigate against the challenges of climate change. We're also, and Andrew kind of alluded to this earlier on, we're also dealing with increasingly challenging supply chains and farmers having less availability of inputs that would allow them to normally carry on conventional practice. So one of the great things that we have been able to do by carbon auditing every business within the group, we have been able to identify key constraints that impact each of the group members, common themes that we can identify, and take kind of coordinated, collaborative action to mitigate against some of those challenges and thereby improve the carbon footprint of individual businesses, but also the agricultural carbon footprint of the island. You can see here that we have seen reductions in the carbon footprints of the beef herds on the island, as well as the commercial flocks. I would just caution or put a caveat on that because the group members have been increasing year on year, that's not necessarily reflective of where the original 12 are, but I think there's some really good messages coming out of it, and there's some really nice practices been implemented. Next slide, please. So, as I said, we have used our own carbon calculator, AgriCalc, to identify, well, to carbon audit each of the members of the group as they come into the group. Some group members will be in what I'm calling year one of their carbon journey. Some members will have had 3 carbon audits completed now over the lifetime of Net Zero Arran, and some of those businesses will have completed an additional 3 under the beef efficiency scheme. But the real takeaway from the group is that we are identifying issues that are pertinent to farmers on the island. Just as an example, some of them, and these will be common themes across Scotland, I'm sure, some of them include overuse of inorganic fertiliser, overuse of fuel, particularly red diesel, and over-reliance on purchased feed. So we've been developing individual strategies with farmers to mitigate against that. Next slide, please. In terms of where we want to go, you'll see there's 2 lists here. The first 3 meetings that we're proposing to have in 2022 revolves around rush pasture management, grassland management. We're really keen to be mapping out grass use on the island and identify areas where there's opportunities for things like tree planting or conservation action. We also want to promote pollinators at farm scale, and I'll maybe talk about that a little later on, but there's some really interesting stuff that we're doing with the Bumblebee Conservation Trust on the island. In terms of the bottom list there, those are the meetings that we have held with the group members since our original launch. So we've looked at whether or not buying groups are appropriate for Arran and whether or not we can have more buying power for the island. We've looked at options to maximise the flock and herd performance of each of the individual members. We've looked at managing conservation conflicts on the island. Obviously, there's a big drive for more tree planting, but we have to be conscious of the fact that every hectare that we take out of the farmed environment is an area that could otherwise be used for a particularly important species. And Arran is dominated by a couple of very important designated sites. This year, we've also covered farm plastics, and we've identified a number of barriers that are specific to Arran with regards to how we get farm plastic from the farm to the recycling centres. Yeah, it's been really good so far. Next slide, please. So to date, the group has found tremendous traction. I've been absolutely overwhelmed by what we've been able to achieve. We've had great buy-in from the farmers. Obviously, not everybody in the group has the focus on carbon that we do, but that's absolutely fine. There are members who are particularly driven by the conservation aspects, and there are members who just want to be farming as efficiently as they absolutely can. There's lots to be done. We're really engaged. We're raring to go. And thank you for tonight, and I'd welcome any questions that anybody has. That's great. Next slide, Alex.
Great. Thanks for that, Alex, and all the previous speakers. So, wow, it's not an easy job to try and find some, summarise some common themes across all of those in 6 minutes or even 8 minutes. I actually expected, given that I'm old enough and ugly enough and been in this game for over 3 decades, that doing more with less. I was expecting we were going to be faced with situations where funding was available historically, and then it's now been withdrawn. And I was going to make the sort of the blasé comment that it's only when funds get tighter that people start to actually work out how best to actually make more better use of them, and that we shouldn't always assume that the funding that was being provided was actually being provided correctly in the first place. Now, elements of that have come out, particularly in Andrew Barnes's presentation, and particularly in Ruth's overview of the sort of leader programme, or part of the leader programme in Northern Ireland. But actually, it was quite interesting to see that particularly Rhoda and Andy, and to some extent Alex, what they are talking about is the funds aren't there anyway in the first place. It's doing more with what little they can get, rather than doing more with even less than they used to get in the past. So, you know, that was an interesting aspect that led me on to think it's not just, I think everybody's saying it's not just money that fixes the problem. You can't just throw money at it. You need to ensure that you know what you want to fix. What is it that needs to be actually achieved? And certainly having that local voice involved, but I'll come back to that, in setting those targets is actually key. So it is about targeting funds more effectively and making the available funds work smarter. But being sure what is the outcome that you actually want. And the outcome is not, as I think it was Ruth that said, just simply sticking money into the community and hoping, crossing your fingers and hoping that will achieve something good. It is being clear what you actually want. And in some cases, that doesn't mean to say that public funding, or whatever the funding stream is, then has to be provided on a continual basis, year after year after year. In many cases, it's ensuring what's the right outcome, what's the desired outcome, and would some form of significant payment be sufficient to actually move individuals or communities from one plane to another, so that they can be in much more control of their own destiny. Whether that's, I think it was Andy was highlighting, providing the facilities, you know, for a little small amount of money, providing the energy audit that allows the warm hub to be actually warm hubs, or whether it's providing funding that provides access to equipment or training, or something that actually moves people into a situation where they can be much more capable of being in control of their own sort of destinies. And what's come through all of the presentations is the need for some form of collaborative actions, whether that's actually collaboration in terms of bringing some different funding streams together, or, which came out of some of the presentations, but definitely what came out of all of the presentations, was collaboration in terms of bringing different individuals or communities together in order to actually try and achieve the desired goals, or more importantly, in the first instance, identify what the desired goals actually should be. And in both of those situations, simply sticking money out there without actually thinking, how can you bring people together? How can you facilitate that engagement? Again, was a key point for me, that actually some of that reduced funding or small amount of funding does need to be paid to some extent on helping bring people together. That facilitation is actually crucial. Everybody was actually highlighting the need for the bottom-up part of that process, not only to actually identify the issues, but also to actually help design the potential solutions actually to that. And so that grassroots involvement right from the start is key, whatever size of pot you're actually dealing with. But again, the need to ensure that all the voices can be heard appropriately to actually help identify that. And that's a bit of a sort of a brain dump from me, Emma. That's what I took from the presentation. Others, I'm sure, took even more, or even completely different. But that was the basic summing up I just wanted to actually present. Thanks for that.
Brilliant. Davy, thanks very much for that. And thank you to all our speakers, Andy, Ruth, Andrew, Alexander, and of course, Davy again. So time for questions, folks. I know Sylvia put a question in the chat for Andy and he responded briefly, but I think, Sylvia, you want to maybe go ahead and ask the question, and then I will take a cue from Jim Hume about diversity. So, Sylvia, you can go first. Thank you.
Oh dear. Hello. I used to work before the pandemic came. I used to work in a charity that worked in rural North Yorkshire, and we tried to set up not something similar to the warm hubs, but with a similar idea. And we found that it was extremely difficult to bring people from such wide rural areas, sometimes people that don't have their own transportation or they cannot drive because of their health problems, whatever it is. And we couldn't get people together to those hubs that were there, either because they didn't have own transport, they couldn't afford it, and exactly because the population is widespread and the numbers were not ticking the boxes that the funders wanted, we'd never managed to get funding for the community rural transport. How did you get about to sort that out? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm just a problem everywhere, isn't it? Transport, I think, in rural areas. So yeah, totally identify with the question. I think part of the answer is actually we're now up to 25 warm hubs spread around the rural parts of Northumberland. So there's quite a lot, and there's a number of others that are kind of keen to sort of join the club, as it were. So that there's more of them, so it makes the distance is slightly less. But as I put in the chat, really, what we've not done is found some money ourselves to give to them to provide transport. They've sorted solutions out themselves. A lot of that's obviously informal stuff, but then some of them, I mean, I was thinking of Hawkwilson as an example, where they do some other activities which are not aligned to the warm hub, which raise money, and part of the use they put that money to is to commission one of the community transport providers, which need to be paid, to actually go around some of the surrounding settlements to bring people in to some of their events. So it's been a combination of things, but yeah, you know, the rural transport problem, it will never be solved because it's impossible. So I think what we've done is, the spirit of our project has been working with the locals and enabling them to try and find the solutions. And it's not raised its head, I have to say, in most of the warm hubs as a particular issue that they haven't been able to find a way of getting around somewhere. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Sylvia, and thanks, Andy. Can I bring in Jim Hume now, please?
Yeah, thank you very much, convener. Great presentations. Really interested in all of them, but I'll try and restrict my questions to one point. Perhaps to Professor Barnes, but anyone can of course ask. And it's all about more with less. And of course, there was in that presentation about aging farmers, and I can declare an interest, having been a farmer myself and farming community, and seemingly I am aging, so I can declare an interest there as well. But there's nothing really mentioned about changing the diversity that we have in farming, and I'm thinking about the Women in Agriculture initiative and many more initiatives that are needed. So I would be interested from Andrew Barnes on what our thoughts are on diversifying those that are involved in the agricultural industry, so that we can get more from more people.
Good question, Jim. So do you want Andrew to answer that first then, and the others? Feel free to chip in, folks. Any of the speakers can come in, so we'll come to
I think Andrew was the good first, because obviously it highlighted the aging male population.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, it's an excellent question, I think. And yeah, there's a lot of work on women in agriculture and bringing in new entrants as well, which, you know, bringing new theories of innovation and new experiences. Excuse me, to help to bring to challenge the norm, I suppose, really, as well. I suppose you're limited by the data you have here. So a lot of what I was doing was looking at what we have. And unfortunately, in a lot of the data we have in Scotland, we have a lot of older male farmers. So you know, when you're looking at the younger farmers, you are seeing differences. You are seeing them as a bit more efficient generally, but it's very difficult to find female farmers within the data that we have. So a lot of studies has found it as positive. It brings in more diversity, and it helps to sort of challenge, as I say, the norms and the habits that we fall into, I suppose, really. But yeah, it's an excellent question, and it needs to be developed more in terms of helping to support, you know, what type of innovation we want, I suppose, within farming as well.
Thanks, Andrew. Does anybody else want to come in? Because I have a question, but I'm happy to defer unless any of our other speakers.
Emma, I can come in on that,
Yes.
on just a couple of things
Yeah,
related, to the leader research. I mean, obviously the gender imbalance was quite remarkable in the Northern Ireland context, and I in the focus group I did with women, you know, one of the issues, and it seems really basic, but it was that the processes for coming together and for evaluating projects were very much imitating local government, which was seen as a, dare I say it, male, pale, stale, you know, environment. And it was something that many women didn't relate to and didn't feel that they wanted to necessarily spend their free time doing, but also they didn't necessarily feel they had the skills or the language to participate in that. So I think there's something there about how communities try and engage with different members of their society, and thinking through some practical steps that can be taken. And I know that some people talked about having alternative forum to like traditional committees that could allow people to come in and allow women to engage much more.
Thank you. Thanks, Ruth. I'm looking to see if there's any other hands up at the moment. Davy, your hand's up.
Yeah,
and then Sylvia.
Yep, and thanks, Emma. Just Jim, just to sort of comment on your question, sort of in generality. Clearly, as you know, we're in the midst of sort of revising our land management support policies. You know, what the outputs that we want, or the outcomes we wanted from our land management support 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or even 5 years ago, are completely different from the wide range of outputs that we're actually requiring from it now. And so it is beholden on us, wider society in Scotland and Scottish Government, etc., and agencies to be actually identifying, as we've just discussed, what are the outcomes we actually want, how best to actually achieve that, and what does that mean for whatever money's in the bubble. And we don't know whatever money's in the bubble as yet, but what we do know is we've got a lot more asks of that pot, so we are going to be asked to do more with less, because there'll be less available for different things. So, you know, do we achieve some of our environmental gains by actually putting more environmental conditionality on some of the payments? Do we actually achieve greater vibrancy and viability of our farming systems going forward by, going back to your first question, encouraging greater diversification and greater input of new entrants into of all shapes and sizes and genders into agriculture, on the basis of asking the question? So I do a lot of work in the uplands. So, you know, less favoured area support payments has done what it said on the tin. It's been an annual payment that's allowed people to actually maintain themselves in farms in those areas. But has it really actually allowed farms to actually innovate and move themselves onto that different plane that I was talking about earlier on? Possibly not. And it possibly, that funding stream, or elements of that funding stream, could be used in a different way to actually stimulate as more engagement and innovation occurring within our agricultural systems going forward. We have to do more with less, but with a greater range of people inputting to what we're looking from our agriculture, at least in Scotland going forward. Thanks, Emma.
Okay, thanks, Davy. I think Sylvia, you had your hand up. I'm not sure if was that to come back in, yeah?
Yes, sorry, I was just, it's about diversity. In any of your experience or research, did at any point the ownership of land and the inheritance of passing down the land and not being able to get hold of land to farm like a common person. Did that ever come up?
Okay. Who would you like to answer that? Do you want? Shall we start with Andrew or Davy?
Anyone with experience and research on it? Sorry.
It might be we can give.
I can make a brief comment on it. I mean, I haven't done extensive experience on this per se, Sylvia, but I do some work with refugees and asylum seekers, bringing them out into the countryside, doing walks, and I'm working with an artist practitioner. We're planning some activities with the Northumberland National Park. And through interviews with those individuals, it's very clear many of them would very much like to be doing work in the land. And I think that's definitely an untapped resource. And I mean, I guess I throw that comment out there and would say not much more than that, but I think there's more work to be done in that and trying to engage with that sort of group of people who are not able to fully contribute to our society. But that's obviously an English context.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. I have a question for folk, I guess, before you come back in, Davy. I had a meeting last week with Stuart Martin from the Dairy Hub and Gary Mitchell, who's the NFUS dairy chairman. And we were talking about recruitment into dairying, and our herds are getting bigger, but they're getting less in number. But we were talking about, and it might be a question for Alexander, but it might, I don't know if he's still here, about having the availability to get people onto farm and supporting young people who might not be as academic, but they want a job on a farm. But how do we help them with template application forms, or template a form that says, I need your national insurance number or a copy of your driver's license if you've got one, or these kind of opportunities with applications for housing and things like that? Is that something that has been talked about, is in process? Is it because I know young people that, you know, apparently they pick up the phone to Stuart Martin and say, I want a job on a farm, how can you help me? But we'll have to kind of almost walk them like step by step through a process. I'm just wondering if that's something that we should be thinking about. Might be a question for our SRUC pals.
Do you mind if I come in on that, Emma? So
Yeah.
Certainly, in terms of how you walk somebody through who just phones up a farmer directly, then we haven't had any engagement with that as such, because what most farmers would say, well, what experience do you have? What training do you have? You know, and what colleagues in our South and West faculty, but also elsewhere in SRUC are doing, are looking at different levels of, okay, it's called apprenticeships, but actually how do you take young people and actually give them training on farm so that they're actually getting that on farm experience, but get the sort of training and the necessary expertise that they will require, either to actually stay on that farm once their training is finished, or actually move on if they so desired, and the individual farmer who's been supporting them, or farmers who might have been supporting multiple farmers supporting one individual, and through that sort of training might have been a more relevant model to actually apply. So we are looking, well, not only just looking into that, we have got a small number of farmers. I don't know how many of them are in dairy farms. It's not within my department, it's within one of the other departments, but we could certainly get more information on that. But it's trying to actually move away from the if you're going to learn something to allow you to work on a farm, you have to come into a college 5 days a week and learn it. We need different models out there, and we're looking to see what different models we can actually put in place.
Good. Okay. Thanks. Okay. I also see Jane's got her hand up, and there's a question from Abigail Williams in the chat that I can either read out, but I'll go to Jane first.
Thanks, Emma. I was also actually just going to note Abby's question in the chat there. I don't know if any of the speakers have seen it and want to tackle some large questions there. I think David Miller has commented in the chat as well. But also there was a comment from Fiona as well, and she may want to come in and expand on that, talking about how we value that which often doesn't have a value and that we need to use less, actually. I also had a question, I suppose, and that was around collaboration. And as Davey highlighted, many of the speakers touched on the need for more collaboration and networking and sharing learning. And I just wondered whether any of the presenters had any reflections on some really sort of practical tips for encouraging that collaboration to happen successfully, particularly if we want to encourage more diverse voices, more young people, if we want to have a more diverse group of people doing these things. How do we make that happen, and how do we bring people together effectively so that all the voices are heard and so that we can move forward? And I think Alex has got his hand up as well there.
I see that. That's great, Jean. Alex, we'll come back to you, and then Fiona after that.
I was just going to jump in and say, with regards to networking, we've obviously had tremendous support with the Scottish Farm Advisory Service. That's continued for a number of years now, but we are actually launching, or sorry, the Farm Advisory Service is actually launching FAS Connect this coming Friday, and we will be experimenting with different groups, operating with different models. Some of them will be along the same lines of what we've done with the Net Zero group. We'll be expanding that to different parts of Scotland. So there will be opportunities for people to engage with the topics that are important to them.
Great, thank you for that. I will get my nose in about Farm Advisory Service and Fast Connect as well, because we've got challenges in the south of Scotland, I suppose, for recruitment. Okay, I see Fiona and then Davy McCracken.
I suppose I know Jane mentioned about less, which I put in the comment because I took the first degrowth course, and there is a degrowth movement across Scotland now, one in the urban central belt, but also in the Highlands as well, called Enough, where really considering how we can live more light touch on the world, and that's really, working towards net zero. And perhaps in that context, I was just going to mention the crofting course that we commissioned the writing of and the accreditation and validation here in the Outer Hebrides. It was to link the curriculum to STEM population decline in the island communities, where traditionally to get on in life was to get off the island, and we did a great education for export business. So one of the things key in the local economy, along with construction, along with aquaculture, along with maritime skills, was crofting, and is crofting. It's a really important part of the economy. And crofting is quite often looked, people look down their noses at it, really, second rate to farming. But I remember the launch of the course now in 2008, which is 50% taught by a biology or a science teacher, and 50% taught by an actual crofter, a Gaelic speaking crofter on the croft, conveniently across the road from the school. And when the biology teacher had grown up on a farm in Wiltshire, a farm that had to generate £40,000 a year before he could even begin to live. And he talked about the inputs and the outputs into the land. And he said the pupils asked the crofter on the course, when was the last time you put diesel in your tractor? And the crofter said, oh, I can't remember. I think it was in August. Scratching his head. And the biology teacher, whose brother's still running the farm in Wiltshire, said, yeah, I put diesel in my tractor maybe 2-3 times a week anyway. He then went on to talk about what the hectares and the acres produced in Wiltshire in comparison to what the crofter was getting out of his field. And of course they were left at less. I can't remember the figures exactly. I've got them on a recording, but the gist of it was that if in Wiltshire they were getting 5 tons of product per acre, forgive me if that's way off the mark, and the crofter was getting 3 tons, yes, the crofter was getting less. But the point was, what were the inputs the crofter had done to get that out? there wasn't really any commercial fertilizer, although I see bags of 7-Eleven sitting at the road end in many places here, even in the islands. But that Neil would be, the crofter would be using seaweed as fertilizer. And so his input was so comparatively less and sustainable. His soil was still healthy in comparison to the more intensive models. So all I'm saying is, and I put in the chat, I've done quite a bit recently on holistic grazing and so on. We import 42% of our food into Britain. We also know that 80% of our crops in Scotland is split between arable feed and the alcohol industry. So perhaps we need to look again as to where food and food production, and I put silvopasture, where we know we need large livestock to open up the sward of grass to contribute to biodiversity, and they can sit in harmony with trees. So we need to have a more holistic look at how we can live more sustainably, perhaps, but also just building on Davy's point, when we know the average age of farmers is 59, the average age of crofters maybe 120, but those young people who've gone through the crofting course, I can tell you in North Uist and in South Uist, the average age of people on the agricultural committees and the office bearers, the chair and the vice chair and so on, they're now a generation younger than they were 10 years ago. And those young people will be qualified in a myriad of things, because crofting always sits along something else, like mechanical engineering or something. But they are rooted in this community because of being involved with land, with crofting or whatever. Anyway, enough said from me, but I just thought I'd put that in.
Great, Fiona, thank you very much. Can you put your contact info in the chat function, actually, your email, because it says Fiona Guest, and just to make sure we've got your right last name and your information. Okay, I'm going to come back to Davy McCracken.
So thanks, Emma. It was two observations which actually bear quite a lot of relevance to what Fiona Guest has just said there. I was initially coming in to actually go back to the question about diversity, and there was a launch last week, an in-person launch last week in the Scottish Parliament I was at, about a Soil Association report about agroecology and agroecological practices, which has just been referred to there. And the MSPs present, actually, there was 4 presentations. I think there were short presentations. They actually drew or made the observation that the individuals who were advocates for those agroecological practices, i.e. doing things differently on farms in Scotland, were all new entrants, were young. They weren't receiving I think 3 of the 4 of them weren't receiving agricultural payments anyway, and they were having to bring that innovation to what they were doing and how they were doing it, because of that, because they were looking to make a living, and they also saw the need to actually ensure that, or they wanted to ensure that the food that they were producing was going to be supplied and consumed locally. Which brings me on into the 2 big questions that Abby Williams had posed. Should we be producing more food, or should we be using less land to do this? Well, actually, we need to ask bigger questions. What do we want to use our food production in Scotland for? That is a fundamental question which should be feeding back to, and then what type of food production systems do we want to support in Scotland, and how do we want to use our land, and how much of that land do we want to be used for food production, how much of that land do we want or need to be using for other outputs, whether it's environmental outputs or social outputs. So there's bigger questions to the bigger questions that Abby has actually posed there, that we really need to tackle in Scotland, rather than actually continuing to go forward in silos. And so we're actively halfway through thinking how we want to actually change our agricultural land management support policies, without even thinking what type of food systems do we want to actually support in Scotland, and how do we want the outputs from those food systems to be used in Scotland as much as elsewhere. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant rather than 2 observations. So.
Okay. Thanks, Davy. One of the things that, because I'm the MSP sitting here listening to what we should do and what we can suggest and what we can take forward to ministers, the Health Committee, the Justice Committee and the Social Security Committee, we all did a roundtable work about tackling drugs issues in Scotland. And I'm thinking about, you know, it's more than the rural committee that has a responsibility for feeding Scotland, and it's more than any net zero committee for coming up with issues around regenerative farming practices, for instance. So I think obviously collaborative working is something that needs to happen, and I think that's something to bear in mind, that we are doing a lot of cross-portfolio working in order to take forward what the net zero actions need to be. So that's something that I suppose if anybody has suggestions of what we could do, what we should do, and I'm happy to take feedback into my inbox, so that, because I am a substitute for the rural committee, and I can, you know, pick things up and talk to colleagues and things like that. So okay, let's see who else has got. I'm conscious of the time. It's 19:23 on my computer, and we are going to finish in about 8 minutes time. So what I'll do is I'll take I'm not sure if Fiona, is your hand up again, or was that a what we now call a legacy hand?
Legacy hand, sorry.
Didn't apologise, you know, we're always muting and unmuting at the moment. Is it Ciara McDermott? Ciara, we'll come to you.
Hi, yeah, sorry. So I suppose this would probably be directed to Dr. Ruth. So I suppose it's more, how do you kind of suppose you would engage those communities that aren't engaging, and how would you go about that?
Great question for Dr.
Yeah.
Ruth.
That's a super question, Ciara. And, you know, if I had the magic answer, I think I might make quite a good living from being a consultant. But I think, I mean, it was interesting for me talking to different third sector organisations, and in the short research that I did, I tried to engage with minoritised communities going through umbrella organisations, and that really didn't get me very far. So I think one of the issues is it takes time, and it's about building it. We get back to the relationship building. It's about building those relationships and going through some of those organizations to help access and tap into their communities. And I know that with regards to young people, certainly there's a Young Farmers Association that are very willing to work closely with the department in Northern Ireland to sort of think through how to engage young people and run events that will allow them to tap into the structures and the infrastructure. But I think just sort of flipping the question, you know, we sometimes, I think, try and shoehorn everybody into participating in the committees and sitting around the table. And it's maybe just turning participation on its head and thinking about different types of appropriate participation, and recognising that there will be different spaces and places that people can have their voice heard and influence decisions that are made and affect change. So I think there's all sorts of ways that it can be done, and it's definitely about working through other organisations and building up those relationships and keeping that open door. And finally, having multiple entry points so that people can get involved in programs, you know, as individuals, and then working up through more formalised and larger scale initiatives. So I hope that answers your question a bit, but it is a great question.
Good, thank you, Ruth. Because we've got like 4 minutes of the time left, I'm going to take that as the last question, Ciara. I hope everybody's okay with that. I think that there will be opportunities for obviously networking and engaging and whatever we do in the future. I'm hoping to sponsor an SRUC event in Parliament as we, you know, probably after recess. So we'll keep Jane in the loop about that. I guess finally, just as we wrap up, I'm going to say thanks again to all the speakers for giving up your time tonight. It's really important that you're doing that. It's really important that I say thank you. And I know from one of the questions that I have is, all the pleases from Rhoda at the very beginning, it would be really good to have a list of what all those pleases were, because she's absolutely right that, you know, the map that she showed of the red dot, the red map where it's like holiday cottages or something like that, that was pretty powerful. And so that would be helpful, I suppose, for us. And but there was some really great information. I took some notes, so I'm sure people will be hearing from me as well. And the final other thing is any other business. There's 2 items from Jane from Secretariat. Do you want me just to go through them, Jane, or do you want to? Yeah.
That's fine, Emma. Yep, just brief things.
Okay.
Yep.
So briefly, we mentioned at the previous meeting that we'd like to update the mailing list for the group because we need to make sure it's accurate. And there's, unfortunately, we have not yet managed to do that, but hope to achieve this over the summer because that's the time to play catch up, I think, with some of the cross-party group information. So look out for a message from SRUC as the Secretariat of the Cross-Party Group on Rural Policy, and then I'm assuming you'll just need to reply to it and say, yes, keep me in the loop, or no, I don't want to be part of it anymore. Hopefully it'll be the first one. And if anyone has any suggestions for speakers or topics or projects, or, you know, they don't, and good news stories are helpful, but they don't all have to be good news. But we've got a note that the regional land use partnerships would make a good presentation or a topic for a future meeting. But if there's any others, please feel free to drop us a message. So finally, as it's 1929 on my surface, next meeting, the date's scheduled to be confirmed, but it'll likely be at the end of September. So this is the final meeting before recess, end of September or early October. And the focus of the next meeting will be the future of agricultural policy in Scotland. So more information will follow on that. So that's pretty much it from me, and happy to, I guess we'll save the chat. So if anybody wants to add to it before the 1929 becomes 1930, put your comments in, and I see a note from Jim Hume that says there are valuable online tools that can identify at-risk communities, deprivation, health, age, broadband, mobile coverage, and so we are doing a health inequalities inquiry in health committee right now, so this stuff is directly links, Jim, with what we're working on in health committee, so it's really important that you highlight that, so thank you. So that's it up to me, unless Jane has a final ask.
Emma, just to jump in, I just wanted to say thank you to you for doing such a great job of keeping us on track for at least 2, if not 3 meetings this year. So thank you. And also thanks to the speakers. That was great. Really diverse presentations, but some common themes. Just also thank you to Jane and Alexa and Abby, who either were or are in the RPC team, who do a lot of the organisation for the meetings as well and don't always get a mention. So thank you to them as well.
Yep. Thanks, Jane, and that's great. Thank you again. I happy to chair the meetings, and it's a lot for me. It's really good. I really enjoy it. So good to see everybody. Enjoy your summer, whether it's recess, whether it's not, and we'll see you in September, October. Okay.
I'll send you some information on the housing profile in the islands if that's useful.
Yep. Definitely, it is useful. So yeah, do that. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Emma.